Marcus Reed stood at the precipice of the mountain, his boots sinking slightly into soil that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. The October air bit at his exposed skin, carrying the sharp mineral scent of early winter. Beside him, Atlas's ears swiveled toward a sound only the dog could hear, the wind channeling through some distant opening, perhaps the entrance to the life Marcus was about to begin. The mine shaft descended into the mountain like a throat-swallowing darkness, and for the first time in 3 years of solitude, Marcus felt something that wasn't grief. He'd come to the mountains of rural Montana searching for what most men find when they retreat from the world: oblivion. Instead, he'd found this. 2 weeks ago, while pursuing a mule deer that had taken refuge in these hills, Atlas had caught the scent. The dog had stopped dead on the trail, his entire body taut with the ancient instinct of his working dog ancestors. A find, an alert, an old habit from his years as a military working dog, deployed across 3 continents, sniffing out the things that killed men. But this time, the alert was different. Not fear, discovery. Marcus had followed his dog down the overgrown path, pushing through manzanita shrubs and Douglas firs that had reclaimed what humans had abandoned nearly 70 years ago. The mine entrance yawned before them like a fossil unearthed, wooden support beams, weathered to the color of bone, still standing. A chain-link fence, long rusted through, hung from the top beam. Beyond it, the mouth of the mountain opened wider, revealing not the suffocating darkness Marcus expected, but a space, opportunity, purpose. The dog had turned to look at him, and Marcus had seen in those alert eyes what he hadn't seen in his own reflection since Sarah died: the possibility that life could mean something again. The mine had operated from 1911 to 1955, extracting copper and silver from the mountain's stone heart. Marcus had driven into the nearby town of Millbrook that evening and spent 3 hours in the county records office, running his hands across documents from another era. The mine had employed 200 men at its peak. It had generated wealth that built half the homes in the valley. Then the ore ran dry, the price of metals collapsed, and the operation shut down. Within 5 years, nature had begun its work of erasure. The structures deteriorated. The equipment rusted. The knowledge of the place faded from living memory into a footnote in a dusty filing cabinet. But the mountain itself remained solid. The passages were dry. The walls were stable. And when Marcus traced his fingers over the survey maps preserved in those county documents, he saw something the original miners had known and later generations had forgotten. The mine ran deep enough, broad enough, and crucially, remained cool and protected year-round. The mountain that had buried men in its labor could, with the right vision, shelter them in safety. Atlas pressed against Marcus's leg as they stood at the entrance. The dog's ears remained forward, but his body was calm. Not a threat alert, a familiar alert. This was a space the dog recognized as significant, marked by his own discovery, declaimed by the bond between man and dog that superseded ownership or propriety. Marcus knelt, running his hand along Atlas's back, feeling the musculature beneath the sable coat. The dog's skin was warm, his breathing measured. They had spent 7 years together, 4 more in the military, now 3 in these mountains. Atlas understood purpose the way only a warrior could understand it. And something in the dog seemed to know that they had found something necessary. Marcus stood and drew a breath that tasted of stone dust and potential. He had inherited enough money from Sarah's parents to live modestly for the rest of his life. But inheritance was a poor substitute for direction. The military had been his structure for 24 years. It had given him rules, hierarchy, clear missions with measurable outcomes. Civilian life had offered him something he hadn't anticipated, a suffocating absence of purpose. Days blurred into other days. The silence of solitude, which he'd initially sought as a salve for grief, had slowly calcified into something closer to stasis. Now, standing before the mine, Marcus felt the first stirring of something he might have called a plan. Not a return to what had been lost, that was beyond recovery, but a creation of something new, a shelter, a structure, a redemption written in stone and engineering. He spent the next week conducting a methodical assessment. Every morning before first light, Marcus and Atlas would descend into the mine with flashlights and surveying equipment he'd purchased from a contractor supply store in Missoula. The main passage ran northwest to southeast for approximately 340 feet, sloping gently downward. The ceiling in the primary chamber stood at 11 feet, with support beams spaced every 18 feet. Atlas would lead the way, his senses more acute than Marcus's instruments, alert to any weakness in the stone or any danger hidden in the shadows. The dog never strayed far from Marcus's side, but his constant surveillance provided a second layer of security. The operational awareness Marcus had learned in the military, now mirrored by an animal whose genetics had been shaped by 10,000 years of partnership with humans. The secondary passages branched off at irregular intervals, some stable and wide, others narrower and prone to small collapses where time had worn at the support structures. Marcus documented everything: measurements, sketches, notes on water seepage, air circulation, soil composition. The temperature remained constant at 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity ran high, roughly 65%, which would require careful attention to ventilation, but also provided advantages in terms of food storage and preservation. What struck Marcus most was the silence, not the dead silence of a tomb, but a living silence, the way the mountain held sound, absorbed it, transformed the drip of water into an almost musical rhythm. And in that silence, he began to envision not just a shelter, but a sanctuary, not just a refuge, but a statement that life persisted, that human ingenuity could transform abandonment into abundance. On the 8th day of his survey, Marcus drove into Millbrook proper for supplies and encountered his first real resistance. The hardware store was a rectangle of weathered wood and faded signage, unchanged since perhaps 1985. Inside, behind a counter stacked with wire spools and paint cans, stood Frank Coulter. The man had owned the store for 28 years, inherited it from his father, and represented the consolidated skepticism of the entire valley. Frank looked up from his ledger as Marcus entered, his weathered face registering nothing. Marcus had been in and out of the store 3 times previously, buying basic materials without incident. But today, Marcus was carrying a list that demanded explanation. 12 sheets of plywood, grade A, Marcus said, sliding the list across the counter. 4 boxes of lag bolts, 3/4 inch by 8 inches, 200 feet of electrical conduit, 1/2 inch. And I'll need to special order 5 industrial ventilation fans, capable of handling high humidity environments. Frank's eyes traveled down the list, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to the expression a person wore when they recognized a familiar type of foolishness they'd seen before. "You're the ex-military guy," Frank said. Not a question. "Navy, retired. You bought the old Kessler property 3 years ago, house up in the Pines, East Slope." "That's right." Frank set the list down. He folded his arms across his chest, a gesture that might have been casual if the tension in his shoulders hadn't contradicted it. "You know what's up there, on the eastern slope, besides your house?" "I have a good idea. The old Copper King mine, closed in 1955, sealed, county regulations. That whole mountain is unstable. Town council had it surveyed 12 years ago when there was talk of a resort development. Engineers said the tunnels were a liability, could collapse, could cave in. Definitely not a place for civilian work." Marcus held Frank's gaze. He'd been trained to negotiate with warlords and diplomats. A hardware store owner in rural Montana presented no particular challenge to his composure. "I'm not developing anything, just doing some personal renovation work. The mine has been dry for 70 years. The structure is sound." "You planning to go down there?" "Yes." Frank's laugh was short and entirely without humor. "Alone?" "With my dog." The silence that followed had weight. Frank picked up the list again, studying it with the expression of a man who had just understood something he'd been trying to deny. The ventilation fans weren't for casual exploration. The plywood and bolts suggested structural modification. The electrical conduit implied power, installation, permanence. "You're building something down there," Frank said finally. "I'm improving the structure, making it stable, making it useful." "Making it what? A bunker? Jesus!" Frank shook his head. He didn't refuse the sale. He was a businessman after all, and Marcus was offering cash. But he did something more damaging than refusal. He told his friends. Within 24 hours, the entire town of Millbrook, all 1,247 residents, knew that the hermit on the eastern slope was doing something crazy with the mine. The commentary began at the diner, speculation at the grocery store. By the following Monday, at the town council meeting, while the project had acquired a mythology of its own, Frank had positioned it not as renovation, but as the delusional fantasy of a damaged veteran. The language of the town's conversation shifted. Where Marcus had been ignored before, he now became visible, and visible in the worst possible way. The object of concern disguised as skepticism, the outsider confirming all their worst assumptions about outsiders. It was in this atmosphere of community doubt that Marcus truly began to understand the scale of his undertaking. He wasn't simply converting a mine. He was pushing against the collective inertia of a small town's certainty that nothing changed, nothing improved, and certainly nothing good came from a man trying to make something of nothing. Marcus returned to the mine the following morning with Atlas. I and the dog seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. The dog's alertness had a different quality now, not just operational awareness, but something closer to protectiveness. As if Atlas understood that his human had announced himself to the tribe and faced rejection, and the dog had moved into a mode of heightened vigilance. The work began in earnest in the 3rd week of October. Marcus had mapped the mine into 3 primary zones: the entry chamber, where the main equipment cluster would be positioned; the midsection, where water sources and food storage would be established; and the deep chamber nearly 340 feet from the entrance, where sleeping quarters and a secondary exit could be developed. The secondary exit was critical. Any shelter, military or civilian, required redundancy, an escape route, an alternative in the event of collapse or emergency. The entry chamber demanded the most attention. The original support beams, while still standing, had lost structural integrity where moisture had penetrated the wood and initiated the slow work of rot. Marcus began the painstaking process of supplementing these natural supports with modern materials. He drove bolts through the existing beams into the solid mountain rock behind them, distributing the load, preventing the slow creep of settling that would, over decades, gradually lower the ceiling. Atlas supervised this work with the intensity of a foreman. The dog would sit at the edge of the work zone, ears forward, occasionally rising to investigate when Marcus moved materials or shifted position. The work was methodical and physically demanding, and Marcus was no longer in military condition. No one was, at 42, after 3 years of reduced activity, but he found that his body remembered. The mechanics of labor, the management of pain as a neutral input rather than a signal for cessation, the ability to maintain concentration through fatigue. These things lived in his muscle memory. After the first 2 days of work, when his shoulders and back ached with a pain that felt clean and purposeful, Marcus realized he was smiling. Not the social smile he'd deployed in town, but something genuine. By the end of the first month, the entry chamber had been reinforced. Marcus had installed 8 new anchor points, each capable of bearing 2 tons of load. He'd carefully removed the deteriorated sections of the original beams and spliced in new pressure-treated timber that had been fitted and cut with millimeter precision. The work had consumed nearly 3,000 feet of careful measurement and adjustment. Atlas had been present for every moment of it, and the dog's presence had become essential to the work itself. When Marcus was positioned awkwardly beneath a support beam, applying leverage to a bolt or stabilizing a piece of timber, he relied on Atlas to maintain perimeter awareness. If the dog's ears swiveled suddenly toward the depths of the mine, if his body tensed, Marcus would pause. Not from fear exactly, but from respect for the dog's senses, which detected vibrations and subtle shifts in air pressure that Marcus's human perception couldn't register. The community's skepticism began to manifest in more organized ways. Frank Coulter led a delegation to Marcus's house in November, ostensibly to discuss safety concerns. They made noise about regulatory violations and liability insurance. They hinted at injunctions and legal action. Marcus listened politely, served them coffee, and eventually walked them to the door. He hadn't asked for their permission. He wasn't seeking their approval. The mountain was his now, as much as any man could own a mountain, and the mine was his to rebuild. What troubled Marcus more than the community's opposition was the doubt that began to creep into his own calculations as November deepened. The work was progressing, but more slowly than he'd anticipated. The mountain demanded respect. Every decision had to be made with absolute certainty, because failure wasn't an academic problem to solve in a second iteration. Failure meant the mountain could take your life and never return it. He found himself working less aggressively, more carefully. Some nights, he would stand at the entrance to the mine with Atlas and allow himself to imagine the mountain saying no, to imagine walking away, to imagine returning to the isolated house and the quiet that had, for 3 years, been both solace and prison. It was Atlas who pulled him out of these moments of doubt. The dog would press his massive head against Marcus's thigh and simply wait, not demanding anything, not offering false comfort, just present, just asserting through proximity and loyalty that the work continued because the work mattered. By early December, Marcus had completed the reinforcement of the entry chamber and moved into the critical phase, establishing climate control and water management. The ventilation system was essential. Without it, the mine could become a toxic environment, a sealed tomb where carbon dioxide would accumulate and oxygen would be consumed. Marcus had designed a system that would pull fresh air from the entrance, route it through the passages via flex conduit, and exhaust stale air through a secondary opening that Atlas's initial alert had helped him locate, a natural fissure in the mountain rock at the 320-foot mark, approximately 140 feet from the main entrance. Installing this system required precise engineering. Marcus calculated air volume requirements based on occupancy. If the mine was ever to serve as a true shelter, it would need to accommodate multiple people. He designed the system to move 8,000 cubic feet of air per hour at the baseline, with the capacity to increase to 15,000 cubic feet per hour in an emergency. The fans themselves were industrial models, capable of operating reliably in high-humidity environments. They were loud, a mechanical sound that echoed through the mine and disturbed the ancient silence that had persisted for so long. But the noise was the sound of purpose, and Marcus found he didn't mind it. Installing the ventilation fans required climbing. Marcus needed to position intake and exhaust hardware at specific locations along the ceiling. He rigged a rope system, anchored to the reinforced support beams, that would allow him to elevate himself safely. Atlas couldn't follow him into the air, but the dog positioned himself directly beneath the climbing points, tracking Marcus's movement with complete attention. The dog's presence below was a kind of tether. Atlas would alert if there was any sound or vibration indicating instability in the rope or in the mountain itself. The water management system came next. Marcus had identified a seepage point where water was entering the mine from an underground aquifer. Rather than trying to seal it, which would eventually prove futile, Marcus designed a collection and treatment system. He positioned collection tanks to catch the seepage, ran the water through a series of sand and charcoal filters, and installed a gravity-fed distribution system that would carry usable water to the deeper chambers. The water temperature remained constant at just above freezing, which provided a natural refrigeration advantage for food storage, but also meant any structure housing water would need insulation to prevent condensation and ice buildup. By the end of December, the mine had been transformed from an abandoned historical site into something that resembled a functioning shelter system. The entry chamber was stable, climate-controlled, and equipped with power distribution that Marcus had carefully run through conduit from a generator positioned at a safe distance from the mine entrance. The midsection had been partially developed, with collection tanks for water and the beginning of a food storage area, built with shelving that Marcus had fabricated from salvaged materials and new lumber. The community's opposition had not diminished. If anything, the visible progress of the project had intensified it. In January, the county building inspector arrived unannounced, citing structural safety concerns. The inspection took 5 hours. The inspector, a man named Garrett, who seemed genuinely uncertain about what he was looking at, ultimately had to concede that Marcus's work met code requirements. The structural calculations were sound, the materials were appropriate, the ventilation system was engineered according to established standards. There was nothing technically illegal happening in the mine. But Garrett warned Marcus about community opinion. "There's a lot of concern about what you're doing here," the inspector said, his voice carrying genuine sympathy. "People worry, they don't understand it. It seems excessive, paranoid maybe, like You're preparing for something. I'm preparing for the possibility that someday people might need shelter, Marcus had replied. That's all. The mountain is here. The structure is here. The opportunity is here. I'm using it. February arrived with heavy snow. The elevation where Marcus had positioned his house made the highway treacherous, and in the second week of the month, a succession of storms left the region isolated. The town was cut off from the state capital. Emergency supplies were delivered by helicopter. And during this period of isolation, something shifted in the community's perspective. The mine, which had been an object of mockery and concern, became visible in a different light. As the storms continued and the isolation deepened, people began to mention Marcus's shelter, not with mockery now, but with something closer to curiosity. Frank Coulter showed up at the mine entrance on a February afternoon, his Carhartt jacket thick with snow. Marcus was outside, clearing ice from the ventilation exhaust, and he saw the hardware store owner approach with the expression that was harder to read than skepticism, something closer to respect mixed with reluctant acknowledgement. "You're mine," Frank said without preamble. "It's really functioning? Water, heat, air?" "Yes." "You've thought about this?" "For a long time." Frank looked back toward the town, visible in the valley below, white and small. "When those storms hit in March, and they will, they always do, we're going to lose power. We always do, for days sometimes. Last year it was 5 days before they got lines restored. People freeze. We lose heat in houses that are 100 years old. It's not good." Marcus didn't respond. He waited. Atlas, who had been watchful during Frank's approach, now relaxed slightly, reading the shift in the old man's body language. "What would it take," Frank asked carefully, "to make your mine available as emergency shelter, if the grid goes down and people are in real danger?" This was the question Marcus had been building toward all along, though he hadn't articulated it even to himself. The shelter couldn't exist in isolation. It wasn't enough to save his own life. The mountain had taught him that in every stone, every calculation, every moment of doubt overcome. The shelter had to be for everyone, or it was just a bunker, and bunkers were for people who had given up on the possibility of community. "It's ready now," Marcus said, "for emergencies. I've been building it with that in mind." The transformation of town opinion, once it began, accelerated rapidly. Frank became an advocate, which carried weight in a small community. The mine was redesignated, mentally, from "that crazy SEALs bunker" to the emergency shelter on the eastern slope. Local government began to integrate it into emergency planning. The school district added the mine to its disaster preparedness materials. By March, when the predictable spring storms arrived, the entire town understood that a backup shelter existed, and it existed because of the vision of a man they had recently dismissed. March brought severe weather. The storms developed rapidly, with wind gusts reaching 60 miles per hour and snow accumulation that exceeded 2 feet. The first storm knocked out power to the valley at 11:47 p.m. on March 14th. The forecast suggested that the lines wouldn't be restored for at least 72 hours. In the darkness and cold, families huddled in houses designed a century ago, before modern heating. The temperature outside dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside houses without power, the internal temperature fell rapidly. By the morning of the 15th, people were suffering. An elderly woman in town developed symptoms of hypothermia. A family with 3 children had a burst pipe that flooded their lower floor, destroying what heating capacity the house retained. Another family's wood-burning stove, used as emergency heat, became a carbon monoxide hazard in a house that hadn't been designed with proper ventilation. The call for help came through the emergency management office to Frank Coulter, who immediately contacted Marcus. The tone of the conversation had changed entirely from just weeks before. There was no skepticism now, no testing, no resistance. There was just the practical reality that people were in danger and a shelter existed. Marcus had anticipated this. He had prepared the mine not just structurally, but practically. He had stockpiled blankets, arranged for propane heaters that were engineered to operate safely underground, stored food and water, and most critically, had implemented a system for large numbers of people to be evacuated from the mountain safely and efficiently. He had spent weeks planning logistics, including a bus route up the mountain, an evacuation schedule, and contingencies for medical emergencies. And Atlas understood something was happening. The dog's alert posture shifted into active deployment mode, the stance the German Shepherd had maintained during years of military service when tasked with finding people. As the first families began to arrive at the mine entrance on the evening of March 15th, Atlas positioned himself at Marcus's side, his entire being oriented toward the work that needed to happen. The first family was the Hendersons, 42-year-old James, his wife Patricia, and their two sons, ages 8 and 11. They arrived wrapped in blankets from their car, teeth chattering, their oldest boy in the early stages of hypothermia, core temperature probably down to 95 degrees, mental processing slowed, judgment compromised. Marcus sat them in the main chamber where the temperature held steady at 48 degrees. To people coming from a house at 38 degrees, it felt like warmth. He provided blankets, hot water for tea, and a designated area where they could rest. Atlas immediately approached the younger boy and seemed to understand the child's distress. The dog stretched out beside the boy, and the child's hand went to the German Shepherd's fur. The contact seemed to anchor the boy, to help ground him in the reality of safety. The second family arrived an hour later, then a third. By midnight on the 15th, there were 23 people in the mine. By 2 p.m. on the 16th, that number had grown to 62. Marcus had planned for this. He had sectioned off areas of the mine for sleeping, designated bathroom facilities, established food distribution protocols, and implemented a system of teams to manage operations. People took shifts maintaining the ventilation system, distributing water, preparing food. Within 48 hours, the mine had transformed from Marcus's private project into a functional community shelter. The crisis that made the shelter necessary also revealed something else: the capacity of the mine to do more than just provide physical shelter. It provided psychological shelter as well. The stone walls held warmth and stability. The light from Marcus's carefully positioned work lights created pockets of illumination in the deep chambers. The presence of Atlas moving through the shelter, checking on people with the gravitas of a working dog trained for rescue operations, provided comfort that mere statistics about temperature and humidity could never match. On the morning of the 17th, with power still out but rescue crews working to restore lines, Marcus received a visitor in the mine. Frank Coulter descended into the main chamber with the gravity of a man confronting something he hadn't expected. He stood looking at the families sleeping in blankets, at the organized system Marcus had created, at Atlas lying beside a cot where one of the town's elderly residents was sleeping peacefully, probably for the first time in weeks, given the warmth and security the mine provided. "You built this," Frank said. You built this before you knew you would need it." "I built this because I couldn't not build it," Marcus replied. "Because the mountain was here, because I had the skills, because Sarah—" He trailed off. He hadn't spoken his wife's name aloud in the presence of anyone in this town. "Because Sarah would have wanted me to build something that mattered." Frank nodded slowly. The skepticism that had characterized his first meeting with Marcus had been utterly replaced by something that looked like understanding. "How many people can this shelter handle?" Frank asked. "Safely, at full efficiency, 40, 41, as of the boy I got in here yesterday with the borderline hypothermia." Frank looked back at the families. "There are 31 people currently taking shelter here. If the power doesn't get restored and the cold holds, we might get close to that number in the town. But we need to know the limits. We need to know if we're pushing the system beyond its capacity." "The limits are structural and mechanical," Marcus said, "not philosophical. The shelter can hold however many people the town needs it to hold. The constraints are air circulation, water capacity, and food storage, all of which I've built with redundancy. But you're right to ask. Planning matters. Knowing limits matters." The power was restored at 4:37 p.m. on March 17th, 73 hours after the initial outage. But the families didn't leave the mine immediately. Some lingered overnight, reluctant to return to cold houses that would take hours to heat back up. Some stayed 2 additional nights, and in those extra hours, something crystallized. The mine became, in the town's collective consciousness, what Marcus had always envisioned. Not a bunker, not a doomsday shelter, but a shared asset, a resource, a manifestation of preparedness that benefited everyone. By late March, the town council had formally recognized the mine as an official emergency shelter. They provided funding for upgrades. Marcus supervised the installation of a secondary ventilation system and a backup power source. The food storage was expanded and professionally managed. The water treatment system was augmented to handle even higher capacity. And Atlas continued to be present through it all as the shelter's unofficial mascot and the living symbol of Marcus's commitment to the community's safety. The story of the Navy SEAL who had built a shelter in an abandoned mine and saved 40 families spread beyond the town of Millbrook. Regional news outlets picked it up. The story of Marcus and Atlas appeared in magazines and online platforms. The narrative was compelling. A man broken by military service, finding redemption through purpose. A dog never forgetting his training, finding new ways to serve. A community transformed by someone they had initially dismissed. But what Marcus understood, standing in the mine entrance one clear April morning with Atlas beside him and the town glowing in the valley below, was that the real story wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about the dramatic rescue or the moment when skepticism turned to gratitude. The real story was about persistence. About understanding that purpose isn't something that finds you. It's something you build with your hands, with your discipline, with the endless small decisions that accumulate into meaning. Sarah had wanted children. Marcus had always wanted to wait, had thought there would be time, and then there wasn't time, and then there was just silence. The mine wouldn't restore that loss. Atlas couldn't change the fact that his handler had spent 24 years in service to a mission that often felt hollow in retrospect. Nothing could undo the years or restore what had been taken. But the mine endured. The families who had sheltered in its chambers endured. The community that had learned, through necessity and the intervention of a man they doubted, that catastrophe could be managed and mitigated. that community endured. And in that endurance, Marcus found something approximating what peace felt like. Atlas pressed against his leg as they stood at the entrance, watching the sunrise illuminate the valley. The dog's ears were alert, but relaxed, the posture of a warrior who had found his purpose and was content to continue the work. Together, they had taken an abandoned mine and transformed it into something that mattered, not for glory or recognition, but because the work itself was the point. The transformation of nothing into something. The manifestation of belief that the future could be different if you were willing to descend into the darkness and carry out the necessary work. One stone, one bolt, one reinforced beam at a time. The mine would endure now. The community would use it, maintain it, remember the man and the dog who had seen its potential when no one else could. And Marcus, finally, had found what he'd been seeking in his 3 years of solitude. A reason to live that wasn't just about surviving loss, but about building something that honored it. Every time a family sheltered in those chambers, every time the ventilation system hummed through the darkness, every time Atlas descended into the mine and found someone in distress, that was the monument Marcus had built. Not to himself, but to the possibility that service could take many forms, and that a single man with a single dog, armed with nothing but discipline and vision, could reshape the world around him. The sun rose higher over the mountains. The day was clear and warming. In the valley, people began their work, and in the depths of the mountain, in the chambers that had been dark for 70 years, the evidence of human purpose, ventilation fans, reinforced beams, stored provisions, prepared bunks, stood testament to the truth that Marcus and Atlas had known from the first moment they descended into that darkness. That abandoned things could be reclaimed, that broken men could rebuild themselves, and that a dog's loyalty could anchor a man through any darkness until he found his way back to light.